December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The morning was supposed to be quiet. Warm Pacific wind, sun rising over Kaneohe Bay. A mechanic, not a pilot, not an officer, walked the flight line, wiping grease from his hands, listening to the distant hum of American patrol planes. And then he heard another sound, not American, not friendly. A scream of engines cutting through the sky like metal knives. John Finn lifted his head and froze. Dozens of aircraft were diving out of the morning sun, red suns painted on their wings, bombs already falling. The first explosion hit the far end of the base, sending a tower of fire straight into the air. Fighters roared overhead, machine guns ripping through parked planes like they were paper. Men ran, men dove for cover, men died. John Finn did none of those things. Instead, the 32-year-old chief aviation ordnance man sprinted toward the attack, toward the bullets, toward the chaos, because unlike most men on that field, he knew exactly what he needed and exactly where it was. A .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a training stand. Not a turret, not a fortified position, just an exposed metal tripod with a heavy gun bolted to it. He slammed the charging handle back, planted his boots in the dirt, and looked straight into the oncoming swarm of Japanese aircraft. He didn't duck. He didn't flinch. He didn't wait for orders. He opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked into the sky, cutting through the morning haze. Japanese fighters banked hard, startled that one man, one mechanic, was firing back with the fury of an entire battery. The ground around him exploded as bullets tore the soil into red dust. Shrapnel ripped into his arm, his shoulder, his leg, but Finn kept firing, kept tracking, kept standing. For 2 hours, he held that position, bleeding, alone, exposed, refusing to stop. By the end of the attack, every aircraft near him had been destroyed. Almost every man around him had been wounded or killed. But the gunner who never should have been a gunner, the mechanic who had no business fighting a sky full of trained pilots, had shot down enough Japanese planes to force them to break formation and divert their attack runs. His actions saved lives. His courage became legend. And before the day was over, John Finn would become something he never expected to be. The first Medal of Honor recipient of World War II. This is his story. The attack slammed into the base like a hammer made of fire. Aircraft burned where they sat. Fuel tanks erupted, turning the sky black. Men stumbled through smoke, coughing, disoriented, grabbing anything that looked like a weapon. John Finn didn't see panic. He heard it. The screams, the shouted orders, the chaotic bursts of gunfire that meant men were shooting blindly, desperate to hit something, anything. But Finn moved with purpose. He had spent years on this airfield. He knew every weapons locker, every tool shed, every turret mount. He knew exactly where the .50 caliber Brownings were stored, and exactly how fast he could get one into the fight. He sprinted across the tarmac as a strafing run tore the ground open behind him. Bullets ripped across the concrete like a zipper, chasing his heels as he dove behind a maintenance truck. The windshield exploded into diamond-like fragments. He didn't stop. He crawled under the truck, emerged on the other side, and charged toward the armory. Smoke rolled over the yard, thick and hot, carrying the metallic tang of burning aluminum. Inside the weapons rack sat a single .50 caliber training mount, a gun never intended for combat. Finn didn't care. He grabbed it by the receiver, muscles straining, dragging the 80-pound weapon into the daylight. He didn't wait for help. He didn't call out. He didn't look for safer ground. He chose a patch of open dirt, the worst possible place to fight, because it gave him the widest view of the sky. A Japanese fighter roared overhead, so low Finn could see the pilot's goggles. The plane banked, its machine guns lighting up like twin rows of welding torches. Finn ducked instinctively, but only for a second. Then he planted his boots, braced the tripod, slapped the ammo belt into place, and racked the charging handle with a sound that cut through the chaos like a declaration of war. He didn't wait for the plane to pass. He led the target, adjusted elevation, and squeezed the trigger. The Browning thundered, a deep rhythmic violence that shook his bones but steadied his nerves. Tracers arced upward in burning orange lines. At first, the Japanese pilots ignored him. One man with one gun? Not worth diverting from the destruction of the base. But then, Finn's rounds stitched across the belly of a low-flying fighter. The aircraft jerked sideways, smoke trailing from its engine as it spiraled away. Other planes turned. Now he had their attention. He had become a threat. The next attack run came straight at him. A formation of fighters dropped out of the clouds, wings flashing. Their machine guns lit up the airfield, bullets hammering the dirt around him, kicking dust into his eyes, ripping through the sleeves of his shirt. Finn kept firing. A round tore into his shoulder. Another slice of shrapnel buried itself near his eye, blood filling his vision. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and continued tracking targets, adjusting his stance, ignoring the pain radiating through his ribs. Every instinct told him to get down. Every command he'd ever been taught said to seek cover. But if he left this gun, nobody else would take his place. There were no pilots left alive near him, no trained gunners, just ground crews scrambling for their lives. So he stood firm. Plane after plane dove toward the field, but Finn's Browning answered every run with bursts of fire so steady it felt like the heartbeat of the entire base. He hit one, then another, then another. Some crashed, some limped away trailing smoke, but each one he disrupted was one less attack on the men behind him. His blood poured down his arm, soaking into the dirt. His hands blistered from the heat of the gun. His legs shook from recoil and adrenaline. Still he fired. The world narrowed to three things: the metal beneath his palms, the roar of engines, and the red sun painted on wings diving to kill him. By the time the attack began to slow, John Finn's position looked impossible. A lone man standing beside a scorched tripod, shell casings piled around his boots like brass snow. The air was filled with floating ash, drifting like dead leaves. The ground vibrated from distant explosions. Somewhere behind him, someone shouted his name, not in command, but in disbelief. He didn't hear them. His ears rang with the echo of gunfire. He held the smoking Browning and scanned the sky, expecting more planes, more danger, more death. But for the first time in hours, the horizon was empty. He lowered the gun. His arms trembled. Blood dripped from dozens of cuts. His uniform was shredded. He should have collapsed. Instead, he looked at the weapon, looked at the yard covered in debris, and said quietly, almost to himself, "All right, now we work." Because in his mind, the fight wasn't over. He believed, honestly believed, the Japanese might return any minute. And until the base was secure, there was no time to rest. He started loading ammo belts with hands that barely worked. And the men around him, stunned, silent, alive because of him, gathered and helped. The smoke over the base thinned just enough for the sun to pierce through, a strange golden light falling across destruction. Burned aircraft lay twisted on the runway, their wings melted into the asphalt. Fuel fires crackled. Emergency crews stumbled through the chaos, pulling wounded men from burning hangars. John Finn moved among them like a man walking through a dream. His shirt was torn open, skin streaked with blood and soot. His left arm barely responded, hanging stiff at his side. Every step sent pain knifing through his ribs. But his face was calm, focused, determined. He wasn't thinking about medals, or glory, or what he had just done. He was thinking about what still needed doing. "Where are the gunners?" he asked a half-conscious crewman being carried past. "Hit? All hit," the man whispered through a cough. Finn nodded once, accepting it, and limped toward the line of wreckage where the base's patrol planes used to stand. Most were gone now, burning skeletons or piles of twisted aluminum. But somewhere beneath the smoke he knew there would still be weapons to salvage. Someone had to get the remaining guns operational. Someone had to prepare for a second attack. His vision blurred for a moment, and he steadied himself on the wing of a scorched PBY Catalina. When he pulled his hand away, it left a streak of blood across the metal. A corpsman sprinted past, saw him, stopped. "Sir, you need medical attention right now." Finn looked down at himself like he was noticing his wounds for the first time. "It can wait," he said. "Sir, you're bleeding everywhere." "So is the base." He stepped forward, but the corpsman grabbed his arm. I said you need treatment." Finn inhaled sharply, not from pain, but from exhaustion. His body had reached its limit long before his mind had. But there was work to do, planes to repair, guns to redistribute, men who needed direction, and he was one of the few left standing. He pulled his arm free gently. "Doc, patch me up just enough so I can move. Then I'll come back." "You won't," the corpsman muttered. Finn didn't argue. He just stared at him until the corpsman sighed. "Fine. Sit down. 5 minutes. That's all you're getting." The makeshift aid station was a scene from another world. Men on stretchers, bandages soaked through, medics shouting for more plasma, more morphine, more hands. Finn sat on an overturned crate while a medic stitched his shoulder, another wrapped his bleeding leg, another dabbed the cut near his eye. Each sting felt sharp, electric, a reminder that he was still alive. "Jesus, how many bullet holes is that?" one medic asked. Finn shrugged. "Stop counting. You should be dead. Maybe later." The medics exchanged glances, equal parts admiration and disbelief. When they finished, Finn stood. Too fast. The world swayed. He caught himself on the medic's shoulder. "You're not fit for duty," the corpsman insisted. Finn grinned, a tired, crooked grin. "Wasn't fit for what I just did either." And he walked out of the tent. Outside, the devastation felt heavier. Real. Men picked through debris, calling names into the haze. A PBY's wing had collapsed entirely. A hangar burned like a furnace, heat so intense the air shimmered. The ground was littered with shell casings, many from Finn's own Browning, scattered like gold across the dirt. Crewmen spotted him limping across the yard and ran toward him. Chief Finn!" He raised his head. "Status?" he asked. "Half the guns are destroyed," one said. "Pilots are dead or wounded," said another. "We don't know if the Japanese are coming back." "We need orders, Chief." And that was the moment when John Finn realized something he had never once considered. The men were looking at him like he was a commander, like he was the one steady thing left standing in the middle of hell. He swallowed, feeling the weight settle onto his shoulders. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let's get to work." He began directing them, assigning repair crews, retrieving surviving weapons, gathering ammunition, stabilizing aircraft that could still be salvaged. Every step hurt. Every order cost him energy he didn't have. But the men moved with purpose now, because Finn believed the attack wasn't over, and if more planes came, they needed to be ready. Hours later, long after the fires died down and the last plumes of smoke drifted out to sea, Finn finally allowed himself to sit. Just sit. On the same patch of dirt where he had made his stand. His Browning still stood there, blackened, overheated, barrel-warped from non-stop firing. The training mount was riddled with shrapnel holes. He reached out and rested a hand on the cold metal. This machine, this improvised gun, had saved dozens of lives, and it had nearly cost him his own. For a long moment, Finn simply stared at it. No anger, no pride, no fear, just quiet. A kind of quiet only men who survive the impossible ever hear. Word spread across Kaneohe Bay long before the smoke cleared. Men from neighboring hangars, pilots from grounded aircraft, mess hall cooks, clerks, mechanics. They all heard the same unbelievable rumor whispered with a mix of awe and disbelief. Some guy stood out in the open with a .50 cal and fought the whole damn attack by himself. At first, nobody believed it. It sounded like a myth born out of fear and adrenaline. But then the wounded were carried in, and every stretcher-bearer said the same name. Finn, Chief Petty Officer John Finn. By noon, officers were searching for him, not to reprimand him, but because they couldn't understand how he was still alive. They found him where he'd always been, on the flight line, leaning against the wreckage of a Catalina, arms crossed tightly to hide the tremor in them. His uniform was soaked through with blood, turning black as it dried. His skin was pale, almost gray, but his voice was steady. "Sir, we're down to 4 operable guns. We can rig 2 more. We'll need belts." The lieutenant held up a hand. "Chief, you need to sit down." "I will, when we're ready for a second wave." There is no second wave. Finn stared at him for a long moment, as if his mind refused to process the idea. No second wave? After the destruction he'd seen? After the sky had been full of fire? He blinked hard. "Then we prepare anyway." The officer exhaled, half frustration, half admiration. "John, do you even know how badly you're hurt?" Finn opened his mouth to answer, but hesitated, for the first time since the attack began. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. Not from fear, but from blood loss. The officer stepped closer. "Chief, how many wounds do you have?" Finn frowned, thinking. "A lot." "How many times were you hit?" "A lot." The officer sighed. "Medical, now." Finn looked back at the flight line, at the charred remains of aircraft he'd known by tail number, at the men dragging hoses across smoldering asphalt, at the twisted metal that hours earlier had been proud American patrol planes. Everything he cared about on this base had been threatened. Everything he could protect, he had protected. And only then did he allow himself to nod. "All right, sir, but make it quick." The base hospital was overflowing, a sea of cots and blood-soaked bandages. Doctors moved between patients in a blur, calling for plasma, for saline, for morphine. The air was thick with antiseptic and smoke, a combination that burned the lungs. When Finn walked in, looking less like a man than a ghost held upright by sheer will, the entire room fell quiet for a heartbeat. The head surgeon turned and stared. "Good God, how are you still standing?" Finn managed a tired half-smile. "Didn't have time to fall over." The doctors laid him on a table and began counting his wounds. Gunshot graze, shrapnel cut, deep laceration, burn, embedded metal fragment, another burn, another wound. They lost count at 20. One young doctor whispered to another. He shouldn't be conscious. But Finn was conscious, barely. Jaw clenched so tight the muscles quivered, refusing to show pain in front of his men. "You saved a lot of lives today," the surgeon said as he cleaned another wound. Finn shook his head weakly. "No, sir. They saved themselves. I just kept their sky clear." The surgeon paused, studying his face. "You don't understand what you did, do you?" Finn didn't answer. Not because he was modest, but because, in his mind, he hadn't done anything special. He had simply done the job in front of him, a job that should have killed him 20 times over. Later that evening, a group of sailors walked past the burned flight line. Someone pointed at a patch of dirt near the center of the yard. "That's where he stood," one whispered. "Right out in the open?" "Yeah, right there." They approached slowly, as if afraid the ground itself held some kind of sacred weight. The scorch marks from strafing runs still striped the earth. Empty .50 caliber casings lay everywhere, thousands of them, glinting in the fading light. A young sailor knelt and picked one up. "Jesus, he fired until the barrel melted." "More than that," another said softly. "He fired until the planes broke off." They fell silent, because no matter how many times they heard it, no matter how many witnesses confirmed it, no matter how many details emerged, it still sounded impossible. A mechanic, not a pilot, not a trained gunner, not someone meant to stand alone against dozens of attacking aircraft. And yet he had. In the days that followed, investigators interviewed every witness they could find. Men from Kaneohe, men from Hickam, men from hospital beds who could barely speak, but insisted they needed to talk about what they saw. Every story matched, every timeline aligned, every account pointed to the same conclusion. John Finn had turned a training gun mount into a frontline anti-aircraft position. He had stood in open ground, under continuous fire. He had drawn enemy aircraft away from vulnerable personnel. He had wounded or destroyed multiple attacking planes. And he had done it long after anyone else would have fallen. Not for glory, not for recognition. but because he believed the men around him needed someone to hold the line. When the investigation reached Pacific Fleet headquarters, the officers reviewing the reports stopped halfway through the first page. It sounded exaggerated, impossible, heroic to the point of disbelief. A single enlisted aviation ordnance man engaging swarms of carrier-based fighters in the open with a training mount for hours? It couldn't be real. But then photographs arrived from Kaneohe Bay, grainy, smoke-stained images taken by stunned sailors in the aftermath. One showed the shattered tripod mount, another showed Finn's blood trail across the dirt, a third showed the cratered ground around his position, a constellation of bullet impacts that looked like someone had emptied the sky onto one man. The admirals went silent, and for the first time since the attack, someone said aloud what everyone at Kaneohe already knew. He fought like a man who refused to die. 2 days later, Finn was summoned, still wrapped in bandages, still limping, to a temporary command tent set up on Ford Island. His uniform looked like it had been through a grinder. His face was stitched in half a dozen places. But his eyes were alert, steady. Commander Ramsey stepped toward him, expression a mix of disbelief and concern. "Chief Finn, you should be in a hospital bed." Finn shrugged. "Sir, they needed the space." "That's not the point." "Then I'm fine, sir." Ramsey stared at him, searching for some sign of bravado. But Finn wasn't boasting. He simply didn't understand the magnitude of what he'd done. He was a mechanic. Mechanics fixed things. And on December 7th, what needed fixing was the fact that nobody was firing back. Ramsey cleared his throat. "I need to confirm your account. The reports, they are extraordinary." Finn paused, then nodded once. "Yes, sir, I can answer whatever you need." He stood straight despite the pain, like a man giving testimony at the gates of fire. Ramsey opened the folder. "Is it true you moved a 50 cal training gun into an open position and engaged attacking aircraft?" "Yes, sir." "Is it true you remained there for nearly 2 hours?" "That's what the men said, sir. It felt shorter." "Is it true you were wounded more than 20 times?" Finn hesitated. "That part's accurate." "And did you at any time consider withdrawing?" Finn blinked at him, confused. "No, sir. Planes were still coming." Ramsey lowered the papers. "And you realize," he said quietly, "that if you had left that position, the casualties at Kaneohe Bay would have been far worse?" Finn swallowed, not pride, but something heavier. "I just did the job in front of me." The commander nodded again, slower this time, the kind of nod a man gives when he realizes he is standing in the presence of something rare. "Chief Finn, the Navy sees it differently." He reached into the folder, removed a sealed document, and placed it on the table between them. "I'm forwarding this recommendation to Washington. Your actions on December 7th constitute above and beyond the call of duty." Finn looked at the envelope as if it weren't meant for him. "I appreciate that, sir, but—" Ramsey raised a hand. "This is not for debate. What you did that morning wasn't courage. It was something we don't have a word for." He stepped closer, voice lowering. "You fought like a man who believed the base depended on him alone." Finn inhaled slowly. "For a moment, sir, I thought maybe it did." Word of the recommendation spread quietly at first, not through official channels, but through murmurs in the mess hall, through hospital corridors, through barracks where young sailors whispered to each other, "They're giving him the big one, the Medal of Honor. John Finn, the mechanic, that's the one. What did he do? What didn't he do?" Men who hadn't even seen the attack stopped him on the walkways to shake his hand. Others slapped him on the back, gently, after realizing he was covered in wounds. Some simply nodded at him like soldiers greeting a veteran much older than themselves. Finn never knew how to respond. He wasn't comfortable with attention, wasn't comfortable with praise, wasn't comfortable with being called a hero. Heroes were pilots, heroes were officers, heroes were the ones trained for combat, not a dirty-handed ordnanceman who spent his days tightening bolts and repairing gun mounts. But the men who had been there, The ones who had watched him stand against a sky full of fire knew better. They'd seen him refuse to break, refuse to bend, refuse to fall. They'd seen him do the impossible. Weeks later, long after the fires of Pearl Harbor had cooled, Finn returned to Kaneohe Bay. The ruins had been cleared. New aircraft stood in place of the burned ones. Fresh paint gleamed on repaired hangars. The base was alive again. But there was one place that remained untouched. A small square of dirt near the center of the yard. The place where he had stood, where he had made his impossible stand against the impossible. Someone, nobody ever admitted who, had placed a single .50 caliber casing on a small wooden block. Carved into it were 3 words: "He stood here." Finn stared at it for a long time, the weight of the moment settling over him. Not pride, not sorrow, something else, something heavier. Because a man does not stand in a place like that without leaving a part of himself behind. He reached down, picked up the casing, turned it between his fingers. Then he whispered to no one, "Wish I could have done more." The Navy didn't forget. Washington didn't forget. America certainly didn't forget. But John Finn tried to. While paperwork moved through military channels, statements, recommendations, eyewitness accounts, Finn returned to the only life he knew: tools, metal, engines, and long hours bent over aircraft that needed fixing. He wore bandages under his uniform for weeks. Sometimes he winced when tightening bolts. Sometimes he had to sit down when dizziness hit him like a hammer. But anyone who asked got the same answer: "I'm fine. Aircraft won't fix themselves." His injuries were severe. Some would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he refused to let anyone see weakness. Because after December 7th, men looked at him differently. Younger sailors watched him the way recruits watch legends, half in awe, half in disbelief that a man made of the same blood and bone as they could have done something so unthinkable. And that was exactly why Finn kept working. He needed them to see that he was still just a mechanic, still flesh and bone, still human. Because if they believed he was anything more, they might expect miracles from themselves and die trying. A month after the attack, Finn was ordered to report to a briefing room on Ford Island. He walked in expecting maintenance updates. Instead, he found a dozen officers seated behind a long table, a bank of war correspondents standing against the wall, and a Navy photographer adjusting his camera. Finn stopped cold. What is all this?" The presiding officer motioned him forward. "Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John William Finn, stand at attention." Finn did, though his right leg trembled under the strain. The officer opened a folder and began reading. "Your extraordinary heroism, your unwavering courage under fire, and your actions far above and beyond the call of duty have been reviewed by the highest level of command." Finn swallowed hard. It was happening. The thing he had been told to expect but never believed. He stared forward, jaw clenched, mocked, "And it is the determination of the United States government that your conduct on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack warrants the highest military honor this nation can bestow." Reporters leaned in. Cameras clicked. Someone exhaled sharply. But Finn didn't move. He didn't smile, didn't shift, didn't breathe for a moment, because it didn't feel real. He had seen men die with honor that morning. Good men, brave men, men who didn't get to stand here and hear these words. He felt unworthy in a way that cut deeper than any shrapnel wound. The officer approached him slowly. "Chief Finn, you are hereby awarded the Medal of Honor." A ripple moved through the room, a mixture of applause, awe, and disbelief. But Finn's expression didn't change. He just stared down at the medal as it hung against his chest, heavy, cold, undeserved. At least that's what he believed, because in his mind, heroes were the ones who didn't come home. He was simply the one who had been too stubborn to fall. Later, away from reporters and officers, a young sailor approached him on the pier. The boy could not have been older than 19. His voice was shaky, unsure. "Chief Finn, sir. I just wanted to say thank you. My brother was on the field that morning. He made it through because you kept firing." Finn looked out over the bay, the water a calm blue that belied the memories burned into it. He didn't turn around. "Son, if your brother made it, it wasn't because of me. It was because he kept moving. He kept fighting." The sailor stood there, silent, not knowing what to say. Finn finally looked at him. His eyes were tired. Not old, just tired, in the way only men touched by war ever become. "You listened to me," Finn said quietly. "I did what anyone should have done. I'm no hero. I don't want you thinking that." The sailor swallowed. "But, Chief, nobody else could have done what you did." Finn's jaw tightened. He hated that sentence, hated hearing it, hated feeling the truth in it. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then let's pray nobody ever needs to again." Back at Kaneohe, men gathered around the machine shop to hear the story straight from Finn himself. But he never told it. He didn't talk about the attack, didn't talk about fear, didn't talk about the moment he thought he might die. When someone asked how he felt standing under a sky full of enemy aircraft, Finn simply shrugged. "Busy." The men laughed, but Finn didn't, because in his mind, fear had no place in the retelling. Fear was for later, long after the shooting stopped, long after the wounds were bandaged, long after silence returned. Fear was something you felt when you finally had time to remember, and Finn didn't allow himself that time. Not yet. In the months that followed, John Finn became something he never asked to be, a symbol. Newspapers called him the mechanic who fought the sky. Radio hosts spoke his name with awe. Recruitment posters hinted at men like him without ever saying the words. But on the base, among the men who had bled beside him, he was still just Chief. To them, the medal didn't change who he was. The photographs didn't change it. The ceremonies didn't change it. Because they had seen the truth with their own eyes. When the world exploded around him, John Finn didn't become someone new. He became exactly who he had always been, stubborn, relentless, and fiercely loyal to the men under his watch. Still, fame came whether he wanted it or not. He traveled up and down the Pacific Fleet, giving brief speeches to fresh recruits, shaking hands, blessing new squadrons. Young sailors looked at him as if merely touching his uniform might pass some piece of his courage into them. Finn never enjoyed it. He would stand behind the podium, jaw clenched, repeating the same line over and over. "Do your job. That's all courage is." But that wasn't what they wanted to hear. They wanted stories of heroism, of the attack, of the fire and chaos, of the moment he chose to stand when others dove for cover. And he never gave it to them. Instead, he returned each night to the flight line, to the smell of oil, the scrape of metal, the humming of engines, the normalcy. Because the truth was simple. He understood machines. He did not understand being called a hero. One night, long after most of the base had turned in, Finn walked alone to the edge of the runway. The Pacific wind was cool, brushing against the bandages beneath his uniform. Lights shimmered across the water. The air was peaceful, too peaceful, and peace was unfamiliar. He stopped where the ground still bore pockmarks from Japanese strafing runs. He knelt, running his fingers over a groove carved into the asphalt, one of the many bullets that had missed him by inches. For a moment, the memories pressed in around him. Not images, sensations. The vibration of the .50 cal in his hands, the sting of metal tearing into skin, the smell of burning aviation fuel, the thundering engines overhead, the knowledge that every second he stayed standing meant another second someone else lived. He closed his eyes. For the first time since the attack, his breath trembled. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pride. It was the quiet recognition of a truth he had avoided. He should not have survived. The odds had been impossible. The fire, overwhelming. The guns, too many. The sky, too full of death. But something, stubbornness, duty, Fate had kept him on his feet. And now, in the silence of a rebuilt base, he felt the weight of that survival settle into his bones. He wasn't haunted. Not yet. But he understood that a part of him was still standing in that patch of dirt, gripping a Browning, refusing to bow. Some men leave the battlefield, others carry it. When Finn finally rose to his feet, a voice called out behind him. "Chief?" He turned. It was one of the young sailors from his maintenance crew, a kid, barely out of high school, face half hidden under the brim of his cap. "Sir, the guys were asking, could you maybe tell us what it was really like that morning?" Finn looked at him for a long moment. The kid's eyes weren't looking for glory. They weren't hungry for violence or legend. They were afraid. Afraid of the war that was still unfolding, afraid of what awaited them in the years ahead, afraid they wouldn't measure up. Finn sighed softly. He stepped forward, rested a hand on the young man's shoulder, and said quietly, "It was hell, son. But hell is just a place. Men decide what they become inside it." The kid swallowed hard, nodded, and walked away. Finn watched him go, and for the first time he understood why his story mattered. Not because he wanted to tell it, but because they needed to hear it. Not to idolize him, but to believe that when their own day came, when the world around them caught fire, they could stand their ground too, even if they were just mechanics, even if they were just ordinary men. That night, Finn returned to his quarters. He sat on the edge of his bunk, unbuttoned his shirt, and looked at the map of scars across his chest and arms. Each one was a moment, a choice. A second he refused to fall. He traced the longest scar with his finger. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, quietly, to himself. Because he finally understood. Courage isn't something you feel in the moment. It's something you discover afterward, when you look back and realize that in the instant fear should have ruled you, it didn't. And that realization, that quiet, private acknowledgement, was the closest thing to acceptance he would ever allow himself. Years passed. The war stretched across continents, across oceans, across the lives of millions. And through it all, John Finn kept serving. Not as a legend, not as a symbol, but as a mechanic. He trained new men. He fixed new aircraft. He prepared young sailors for the realities of combat with the same blunt honesty he had given that frightened kid on the runway. "Courage isn't special," he would tell them. "It's just doing your job when you're scared." They believed him, not because of the medal on his chest, but because of the quiet authority in his voice, the kind that only comes from having earned every word. When the war finally ended, men celebrated in the streets. Flags waved, horns blared, strangers embraced. But Finn didn't shout, didn't cheer, didn't revel in victory. He simply packed his tools, folded his uniform, and went home with the quiet dignity of a man who had already lived through his defining moment and survived it. He returned to California, to the life he had left behind, a small house, a familiar workshop, the simple rhythm of days uninterrupted by explosions or alarms. Neighbors greeted him with warm smiles. Children ran up to him with questions. Some knew the story, others only sensed they were in the presence of someone important. Finn answered every curiosity the same way. "I'm just an ordnance man, kid. I fix things." But time has a way of revealing truth, even when modesty tries to hide it. Decades later, long after the fires of Pearl Harbor had become history instead of memory, Finn was invited to anniversary ceremonies. The crowds were larger now, tourists, schoolchildren, veterans with silver hair. They spoke about sacrifice, about honor, about the day the sky over Hawaii burned. And sometimes at the center of these gatherings stood an old man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much. Reporters asked him, "Were you scared? Did you think you would die? How did you do what you did?" Finn always answered the same way. "I was angry," he'd say. "Angry we were being attacked. Angry my men were in danger. Angry enough to fight back." Then he'd shrug. That's it. No big secret. But those who listened closely understood. That anger, that duty, That refusal to bend was exactly what made him extraordinary. In his late years, he lived quietly on a small ranch in California. Chickens in the yard, tools in the shed, the Medal of Honor tucked away in a drawer, not displayed, not polished, not paraded. He didn't need to see it every day. He carried the memory in his bones. Visitors would sometimes find him sitting on his porch, staring out at the dusty hills, hands resting gently on his knees. If they asked what he was thinking about, he would smile and say, "Nothing important." But deep inside, in the places he never spoke of, he still heard the roar of engines, still felt the recoil of the 50 cal, still smelled the burning fuel on a December morning that had changed his life forever. John Finn passed away in 2010 at the age of 100. He was the oldest living Medal of Honor recipient at the time of his death. At his funeral, sailors folded the flag with slow, precise movements. Former shipmates, white-haired now but standing straight, saluted with tears in their eyes. A Navy bugler played taps, the notes drifting into the warm California air. And on a small table beside his casket lay the same medal he had once tried to pretend wasn't a big deal. It caught the sunlight and glowed, not because of the medal, but because of the story behind it. History books describe John Finn as a hero. Military records describe him as exceptional. His medal describes him as brave beyond measure. But the truth, the real truth, is simpler and heavier. He was a man who stood his ground when the sky fell. A mechanic who fought fighter planes with nothing but anger, courage, and a 50 cal he wasn't supposed to use. A man who refused to bow to fear even when death screamed down from above. He didn't consider himself a legend. He didn't believe he deserved praise. He didn't think he did anything extraordinary. But on the morning of the Pearl Harbor attack, John William Finn made one choice, the kind of choice that defines a life. He stood up, he fought back, and he did not fall. Not because he was fearless, but because the men around him needed someone who wouldn't break. In the darkest hour of one of America's darkest days, he became that man. And that is why his story endures.